Alright, let's start the day off with some Quazii. WoW players wish community is more like Final Fantasy XIV, yet WoW players are the people who are creating the community the way it is. This is probably about toxic people. I read a bit of what the post is about. I'm assuming this is mostly dungeons, because that's the only time you really interact with other people. If you are in the world, you don't really interact with them, so it's like you don't talk, you just gang up on a poor boss and kill it. And from my experience, I can tell you already, I am either the toxic player or someone's being toxic to me. There's rarely a run where everything goes well, but I would say vast majority of the runs, either I'm the toxic one or someone else the toxic one. And there are reasons for it, but, you know, like I am justified in my toxicity, but at the same time, the game, the way I see it, the game is designed for you to be toxic. The reason I'm saying that is because, so, the dungeons have multiple paths that you can take. There are ways to skip mobs and stuff like that, which once you know how to skip, you really don't want to do those mobs again. You can make the run a lot faster just by skipping stuff. Now, some people don't know it and you teach them the skips and they're like okay with it, or they try to skip and they fuck it up, you know, stuff like that. So I would say most times it's not really worth to skip because people suck at skipping. But you still try and you still hope. And then when your hope crumbles to dust, you're like, fuck these guys, okay? So, yeah. Also, however, instances where people were toxic to me was when I was playing on my monk, and I have very bad, I don't know what it is with the monk. I'm very bad monk, okay? I just need to get good, but I'm taking way too much damage. Even if I'm purifying, even if I'm self-healing, stuff like that, I'm taking way more damage than any other tank that I have played so far. I've leveled up the warrior, the DK, and the paladin, and the demon hunter. Monk is my last tank, and by far monk takes the most damage, even with all the staggering that I'm like removing, reducing, and self-healing. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just that my gear is substantially lower, but honestly, I didn't have this problem with the DK or with the Demon Hunter, who were substantially, like, they started like 180, 185 item level doing dungeons. The monk started at the similar item level and kept doing dungeons, so I find a lot harder on the monk for some reason. So yeah, people were being very toxic to me because I couldn't pull as much as I could on other tanks. But yeah, anyways, let's see what the video is about. I'm assuming that's pretty much the gist of it.
So you know how the 14 community always has this debate about whether we should allow add-ons, third-party stuff like DPS meters, and whether or not we should make dungeon content way more punishing than it currently is. This is an ongoing discussion that I've seen many times in the 14 community, and today I have a very good case study for you. The purpose of this video is not to say that 14 dungeons are better than WoW dungeons or the 14 community is better than the WoW community.
I would say in some aspects the 14 dungeons are better because they're more linear and people can do outlandish shit that confuses other players. However, I would say WoW dungeons are better because they offer more options on how to do the dungeon.
No, that's not the purpose.
Usually.
The purpose of this video is to show you with the launch of WoW Dragonflight how some of the 14 players who are now trying World of Warcraft Dragonflight dungeons for the first time are essentially wishing that the community there and the players there are, you know, way more friendly when it comes to new players, when it comes to tanking, and basically doing new dungeon content. And all these simply goes back to the idea of the community. What?
No. The other thing it goes back to, in my opinion, is because you are either, like, you're rarely grinding dungeons for leveling. Some people do, but like for the most part, I would say it's not the best way to spend your time per hour unless you really have nothing else doing, so you'll just grind dungeons for XP. But like, honestly, per day, you can get like your dailies, like duty roulette, and just finish leveling there. But if you're like in a rush to level, then yeah, you might be spamming dungeons. And even if you are spamming dungeons, it's not as... like each dungeon, if you're spamming like the spammable dungeons for XP, 10 to 12 to 15 minutes maybe. And they're very linear, so people don't really do that many mistakes. The dungeons are like, all the dungeons are basically the same formula. 2 packs, 2 packs, boss, 2 packs, 2 packs, boss, 2 packs, 2 packs, boss, right? It's like, that's pretty much every dungeon. The scenery just changes, which is fine. The problem is with World of Warcraft, so first of all, the dungeons are, takes a long time to get back to where, if you die, get back to where you were. The dungeons, even on normal, depends on the tank and the healer, can take like 30 plus minutes. Or let's say 20 plus minutes, right? They don't really reward you with much, and you have to keep spamming them, right? Like constantly, the same dungeons, spam. I feel like that's a very annoying thing to do, and like at some point, like I'm right now, I leveled my 9th, almost my 10th character to level 70, and a lot of times it's like questing and a lot of dungeons in between. And yeah, I'm sick of doing the same 8 dungeons, if that, right? Like you kind of do the 8 dungeons, but you usually get like the same 4, and you're like, fuck this again. Like, okay, at least there's a skip here, but then the guy doesn't know the skips. Like, oh my god, man, it's like fucking, this is taking way longer than it should. And then the guy wakes up the Drake, and it rakes up the trash. And you're like, why? We don't need this, It's like all these like small mechanical things which like make the dungeon interesting, also make the dungeon extremely fucking annoying with when you do with players.
It's the kind of community you will foster due to how your dungeon content and how your game is set up. And I'm sure you already see the highlighted text that I shown at the start of the video, but what you have not seen is on the WoW Reddit, there's been rampant comments about how, Mythic Zeros, Mythic dungeons are essentially already toxic. We are not even 1 week into launch and people are already complaining about how players are toxic in dungeons. If you do not know the mechanics, people are basically gonna rage on you. And as a tank, if you don't know the direction and what to pull and what not to chain together as a pull, people are gonna rage on you.
100%.
And it's not just an isolated incident, right? This post on the WoW Reddit, 3.3 thousand upvotes. Can some of you count the F down in dungeons?
No.
More examples, crazy.
The thing is, so this post makes sense if it was on the first week. But on the second week, people expect everyone to already know all the mechanics. Now, not all the mechanics that matter. Okay, so mechanics that would like basically wipe or kill you instantly. Those ones you need to know. For example, mechanic that you probably no one cares if you know is soaking sands on the last boss of Legacy of Tyr. I mean, I personally didn't know it. I don't think anyone really cares if you know. It's just like a haste buff or whatever. It's like, whatever. But if you didn't know that, let's say the third boss in, what's that place called? Let me tell you. The third boss in, Jesus. Halls of Infusion. The third boss in Halls of Infusion. If you don't know to hide behind the bright crystal, right? It's like you instantly die in Mythic Zeros right now. Unless like you're already like 380, but if you're 380, you don't really need Mythic Zeros, so it doesn't matter. But yeah, when like the first or second time you clear it on the second week, usually people will already expect you to know the mechanics. Because if not, we have to do this boss over and over and like whatever. I personally didn't mind this one specifically, but I understand the frustration that people have because they want to do it, get it done, go do their rares that they have to wait an hour per rare for, and all that stuff, because there's a lot of delays in this game regarding gear. Right, and then you do all these Mythic Zeros, and like out of 8 runs, especially on the second week, you get like maybe 1 or 2 pieces that you could actually use. Everything else is trash. First week, everyone is happy because almost anything you get is an upgrade. Everyone's like, and everyone's like exploring. Second week, no, exploration is done. You expect people to have explored as much as you, and it all goes to shit. Right, your gear right now really comes from Mythic Zeros, like the beginning gear, and then after that is like farming the rares and stuff like that. So people are really frustrated when they're not getting the shit they want from Mythic Zeros, plus people delaying them because they're not done on mechanics. So I get that. The reason this is a very toxic environment in WoW is not so much because the players, because the game revolves so much around loot that there's That's the only thing that matters to people, right? It's like you're not doing a dungeon for the 10th time for exploration, right? No one is farming dungeons in, let's say, Final Fantasy XIV for gear, right? Maybe some catch up on an alt or whatever, but even that is not really. You just do it the one time for the story, and then sometimes you get on the roulette, and that's it. You don't care about the dungeons as much. Here, dungeons, especially now, are the main way to get gear. Listen, you're not getting gear, you get frustrated. People fuck you over with not knowing mechanics, you get frustrated. All of this build up, right? And it's like, you can say it's the community, but I would say the game breeds the community to be that way.
Crazy how toxic people are in normal dungeons. I'm not even in mythic dungeons. Let's be very intellectually honest here. I believe in both games, the majority of people you meet in dungeons are actually nice people. However, I would argue the problem in both games is not the majority. It's the minority of players that will be toxic. Now,
I disagree. I think majority of players you would meet in WoW are toxic. Okay. Let me correct that. Majority of cases when you're in a dungeon, there is at least one toxic person. Technically, that is a minority. It's like 1 out of the 5 people is toxic. But it is a majority in the sense that with every content you would do, there's at least one toxic person. That makes majority of content that you do with other people toxic. Let's say it like that.
Degree of toxicity is different though because of how the game is set up, like I earlier mentioned. And it really boils down to 2 main things that is a very constant debate within the 14 community that I think is worth talking about in this video. But before we talk about 2 main factors, let me just kind of paint you a picture of what Final Fantasy players who are trying out WoW Dragonflight are currently experiencing. And I can relate to this because I main a tank in World of Warcraft previously, and in Final Fantasy XIV I main a tank as well. Now Zero Mac Shrimp says, I wanted to make my warrior a tank, learn the basics and look at rotation. Did some dungeons, doing my job fine, having no trouble surviving and clearing packs. Then I get flamed on heroic
100%.
dungeons for not going fast enough and doing little pulls. Meaning he pulls 1 pack by 1 pack, which honestly to me is very reasonable for the first week of the expansion.
Again, if this is the first week, maybe. But here's the thing. So people care less about wiping on the first week than they care about going fast. And in my opinion, as a tank, this is like just my experience as being a tank for like many expansions, always limit test. Going safe is not only boring for the healer because he won't have anything to do. It is boring for the DPS. I got disconnected, okay. Is boring for the tank, for the DPS, and you're not challenging yourself to learn your own limits. You're never gonna use a cooldown, anything like that. Personally, I hate tanks that go extremely slow as a healer. When I'm a healer and tanks go extremely slow, I really hate that because it doesn't let me learn my healer properly in like, oh shit moments, and nothing really prepares me for like when shit will happen later on. So I would rather tanks go fast and wipe, and me realizing what I could have done, like seeing like, oh, I had this cooldown still, like I didn't use this cooldown, maybe we could have lived, right? You're not letting people learn the game as well. So that's my philosophy on how to tank. Being afraid of dying is probably the worst thing you can do as a tank. Fucking limit test that shit. But pay attention if the healer's keeping up, right? It's like, I'm not saying pull the whole fucking dungeon and be like, oh, the healer can't keep up. No, limit test. 3 packs. People are taking a lot of AU. Okay, 2 packs next time, right? Stuff like that. It's like but you gotta test it out. Pulling 1 pack at a time, especially when it's like 2 mobs, like, okay, like, bro, like nothing is gonna happen, you know? It's like, just fucking get on with it.
How do you expect the tank to know that you cannot pull group 2, 3, 4, 5 together because there's 6 casters in the pack? You learn by doing dungeons. And I think it's really unreasonable to expect people to learn so quickly. Anyway.
But they will never learn if they pull with 1 pack at a time. That's the thing. They will never learn if they only pull 1 pack at a time.
Where he goes on to say, couple times DPS pulls more pack, expecting me to react fast and draw aggro from them like I'm their little pet.
Now, this is where tank ego comes into play, what he said just now. Couple times DPS pull more pack, expecting me to react fast enough. Now, the DPS needs to be smart enough. Okay, yeah, it is locked. Can I move? Oh, okay. Yeah. What's it called? A lot of times I would pull for my tank if I see him being slow instead of flaming him, but I would make sure the mobs will go through the tank, or if they're casters, I would run far back enough that they have to come closer and the tank can grab them. If you just pull shit and they're on the side casting and you're not doing anything to like solve the problem for the tank to reach them, then you're the problem as the DPS. I never mind if people pull extra and like, but you know, you pulled extra. I'm not supposed to guess that you pulled extra, even though I am usually aware that people are pulling more. But at the same time, you gotta bring that pack to me, right? It's like you can't just like, you know, do whatever you want and expect me to like run around and grab shit you pulled. That being said, if it's a pull by mistake, first of all, I will flame the fucker, and and second of all, like I can't expect him to bring it because the person who pulled by mistake is also probably panicking.
I'm already done with tanking, going back to Fury, which is a DPS spec, and I won't look back anymore. By the way, I was a main tank in 14 and I never experienced such toxicity in a short time. Someone follows up here to say, yeah, I've played WoW for years and never liked tanking for the reasons people are talking about here. The actual gameplay of tanking was fun for me until I started getting flamed if I didn't vigorously study every Mythic Plus route and perform perfectly.
Yeah, 100%. If it's your key, you would get less flamed as the tank. Don't get me wrong, because like no one is risking their key. But if I have a key, I'm a DPS, and I bring you as a tank, I expect you to know what the fuck you're doing. Yeah. And again, you can't even blame it on the player. It's just the way the fucking game works that ruins it for everyone, you know? Like, that's just how it is. Ooh, nice.
Totally relate to this. Tank anxiety is definitely one of the biggest topics when it comes to WoW Mythic Plus tanking. Basically, I needed to be good at math in my head to know that I couldn't pull too much mobs, if not I'll be overcount, pull too little mobs and it's too inefficient. It's crazy expectations and balances that you have to deal with. He goes on to say, picked up Final Fantasy XIV last year on a break from World of Warcraft few months before Endwalker release and fell in love with tanking there. Tanking in Final Fantasy XIV has its own learning curve and challenges to overcome, but it's always...
I would say not really. Maybe for Savage, yeah, but like as far as like tanking everywhere outside of Savage and Ultimates has absolutely no learning curve. Other than activating your aggro button and just doing some AoE damage. You can go slow, you can go fast, you're not very likely to die in Final Fantasy XIV as a tank as long as the healer is like nearby. Like it's not... I wouldn't say there's much of a learning curve there. It's extremely fucking easy. And like you get your AoE abilities like as your like second or third ability to use. So it's like one AoE and that's it. Nothing leaves your ass anymore.
Welcome learning as opposed to flaming for not knowing, at least in my experience. The difference in community is huge. Sure, 14 has toxic people and WoW has great people, and that is a factual statement. Like I said,
this is true.
Toxicity in both communities is the degree to which it festers. But it seems like the majority is the opposite in randoms. I think in 1,000 hours of 14, I've run into one person that was a dick on the level of
because they can get banned.
Loving Dragonflight so far, but man, I wish the community overall was a bit nicer. So we have kind of read enough to already discern what the first problem is, which is World of Warcraft dungeons and Final Fantasy XIV dungeons, they are not exactly apples to apples comparison.
They're very different.
The purpose of this video is not to say this dungeon content is better than the other. It's to bring up the point that in 14, a lot of people have been advocating like, maybe we need harder dungeon content. We need trash mobs that actually are difficult. For example, this trash mob will do A, B, C, D.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? Trash mechanics don't really exist in Final Fantasy XIV. The focus in Final Fantasy XIV dungeons, which is what I like the more, is the focus is on the bosses. Whereas like in WoW, a lot of the focus of the dungeons is the trash mobs. They have too many abilities. They have like, you have to interrupt properly. There's AoEs. The healer needs to do shit, which is again, it's good and bad at the same time. Like there's like positives and negatives, but in my opinion, dungeons are also for bosses. Even though like raids are there for the bosses and dungeons can be a mix, but like I don't know. I personally feel like I go to a dungeon to beat a boss, you know, and like having to deal with so much trash, not really fun for me. Whereas like Final Fantasy is just literally the boss fights pretty much like a lot of them are very extravagant, like very cinematic, like they just look good to fight. They have mechanics that are cool, that also mechanics that would lead you to learn these mechanics for the raid, stuff like that.
EE ability, and you need to play around the ability. You need to know the mechanics here. You need to know that you need to stun this cast and you need to interrupt this cast, and it's on a 2-person interrupt rotation and things like that, which is what World of Warcraft expects people to do in their dungeons. And this discussion was definitely brought up again when they launched Variant and Criterion Dungeons of Final Fantasy XIV. And sure, Criterion Dungeons and the Savage equivalent definitely had very difficult trash mobs that hit very hard, but the level of complexity is definitely not like World of Warcraft. So taking a step back here, right? 14 Dungeons in a nutshell is very heavily integrated into the storytelling and the MSQs. Very heavily integrated. Can you imagine you got to the final dungeon of Endwalker and you spend hours and hours wiping there because on the first week of launch, people didn't know what the trash mobs did. And they didn't know that, well, this guy does like a frontal kono, this guy does like a chariot.
But again, I would say no one, that comparison is not really fair, because that comparison is like comparing like a regular Final Fantasy dungeon to a normal mode of a dungeon. And in my opinion, normal mode for even in WoW wasn't really, no one was really wiping unless like substantially under geared, which if you are, you probably can't even queue into dungeons. Like I'm saying, like under 180 item level, right? Stuff like that. So, I mean, not really the fairest comparison, but the point is still there. It's like in WoW, the dungeons are not as mandatory. Because like you don't have to go into a dungeon until like later on in the game. You can do it, but you don't have to. In Final Fantasy, dungeon is a part of the story. You have to go through the dungeon to continue the quest line, which then makes it so the dungeon has to be easier. I wish they would make a mythic version for those dungeons specifically. Like all dungeons for that expansion, in my opinion, should have a mythic savage version that is harder and stuff like that for people who want more gear from that. I think that would be cool, but that could also breed the toxicity that happens in WoW, so I understand why they wouldn't want to do that.
AoE, and there's all these things that the beginners have to figure out. Then suddenly the entire story experience will be soured, because I think 14's approach is always storytelling first. That has always been the key selling point of Final Fantasy XIV. The MSQs. So that is sacred and that cannot be basically ruined. And because dungeon content in general is so tied to the story, I feel like if they ever go down the path of World of Warcraft and require the tank to know all these complex math problems and routes to take, then you have exactly what you see on screen. Like in groups, people get frustrated with you as a tank because you don't know where the hell you're going, or don't know what the hell you're doing, because all they want to do is just get to the end of the story and you are the one impeding them. And this is precisely a very good case study of how the grass might always seem greener on the other side, while it's easy for us to make demands like we want harder trash mobs, we want way harder dungeons. This is the trade-off that you experience, which is some of the toxicity that you will face in group content.
Again, I don't necessarily agree that is the reason. Like, having harder dungeons with... Okay, so for example, if the dungeons in WoW didn't reward you gear, they just reward you cosmetics and stuff like that, people will be less toxic. Okay? Because in my opinion, the reward is what makes people, first of all, do the dungeon, and then also be annoyed at people like wasting their time. When you go into like a dungeon for cosmetic, you are more than likely, like you're more likely to go for a dungeon for cosmetics with a group of friends than you are to go for a dungeon for loot with a group of friends. You know, in both cases you would do it with friends, but I would say it's likelier that for a cosmetic run you would do it with a group of friends, guildies, some people you already know, right? So also you would be less toxic there and stuff like that, and you can also make it a lot more challenging. Same with like why a lot of people are not as toxic in ultimates, at least from what I have seen of people like doing ultimates, compared to people who are doing savage prog. You know, progging on ultimate doesn't feel as toxic as progging a savage raid. And that's because in the savage raid you're going for the gear, whereas like in an ultimate, first of all, this is not really going away, you can always do it, we're all here for the same reason, which is a MOG, which again, there's no time limit on this, right? So like this time constraint, which is a big part of like why people are toxic in WoW right now, doing your mythic zeros, right, is like your top priority. The week starts, you do your mythic zeros, right? And you want to do them as fast as possible so you know what items you need to farm out throughout the week with the rares, with the chests, and all that stuff. This is time constraint. This is like time pressure. Time pressure will breed toxicity. Same with like Mythic Pluses. The whole, like, a Mythic Plus dungeon has a time limit, right? So it's like there is already a time constraint, right? So that what brings up the toxicity, in my opinion. Not so much the just the design of the dungeon, which in my opinion in WoW, the dungeon design also breeds toxicity.
Now, is there room for more difficult dungeon content in Final Fantasy XIV in the
Obviously.
future? I actually think so. I think Variant and Criterion Dungeon was their first step to testing difficult dungeon content.
Yep.
They didn't want to go too crazy with it, but you can definitely sense in the Criterion Savage, dungeons, the mobs, the trash mobs before the boss, they actually truck. Pulling wall to wall is impossible. And they have now started doing stuff like untelegraphed AoE and frontals in the Savage mode. And I do think 14 is kind of pushing the boundaries on that, but they couldn't go too fast either, because if you go too fast and implement all these difficult content, again, you end up with what you see on screen here. Potential frustration for the player base because it fosters this kind of pressure.
Yeah, you need to give a learning curve as well. You can't just like go balls to the walls. Like imagine you're playing Heaven's Ward raid. It's like you're doing Alexander, and then they release the ultimate for Heaven's Ward, right? The Heaven's Ward ultimate that they released in Endwalker. Imagine that difficulty spike. It's like, bro, like like it's not mechanically, like people didn't get that learning curve yet. So yeah, that would be too much.
Pressure on tanks or on players to understand exactly what they're doing in the dungeon. If not, the content is just not doable and the group falls apart. So that's the first discussion point that I wanted to raise in this video. This debate about more difficult content in dungeons for Final Fantasy XIV. Again, I'm not saying that we don't want difficult content in 14. I'm just saying that if they go overboard with it, you basically get the backlash that you see on screen. And now let's move to the second point I'd like to bring up. Another Final Fantasy XIV player who tried out Dragonflight said, my opinion is it's mostly mods and some other things. DPS meters being widely and openly available to a user base referring to WoW, without the wisdom or desire to use them properly is a huge problem. 14 has damage meters, but you're forbidden to mention them in the game in any way. So they're used for self-satisfaction purpose only. And to a certain degree, he is kind of right. In World of Warcraft, it's so easy to point out where the dungeon went wrong. Like for example, if you fail to meet a DPS check and the boss enrages. It's very easy to just...
The people who are making these comments haven't gotten there. Even if he's talking about DPS meter, I have not heard anyone yet complain about people's DPS. And we've had runs where like people doing 30k and some people are doing 4k. No one cares, right? It's not a big deal right now. People doing shit DPS, they can be leveling in all, they can be, learning the class, whatever. I don't think anyone really cares about the DPS as much. However, one thing is true though, some dungeons require a lot of interrupts. When you go to the, like I have the damage meter here, you can barely see it on the screen, but there's an option then to check the interrupts, how many interrupts each person did. And then if you go to like the mobs that have fears and you see like only one person has like 6 interrupts and everyone else has 0, yeah, that's probably why we wipe, because people are not interrupting the fears and then we get feared everywhere and like we just, get screwed up. So that's something that did happen, and I can understand the frustration from that. Okay, like people are just not doing what they're supposed to, but damage for now hasn't been an issue. This will be an issue later on though, for sure. Mythic Plus and raids come out.
Just glance and say, hey, Hunter, you're doing 10% the damage of everyone else. It's also easy to look at a healer and say, hey, healer, the tank is out healing you. What's going on here? You can even filter down to the level
Depends
of,
on the tank.
Hunter, you did 0 interrupts while the Demon Hunter did 10 interrupts. And because you miss an interrupt here, we wipe. It's easy to get data like that, and for the longest time, players have been leveraging on the data to basically troubleshoot what the problem is. However, the downside to this, widely enabling third-party add-ons, which is a very hot topic in 14, the downside to enabling the widespread usage of, external add-ons and tools is this, which is basically you hand people the ammunition to be toxic, to say, you're such a bad player, you're only doing 20% or 30% of your potential output, or something like that. I'm just bringing out the point that one of the biggest,
totally agree with it.
counter argument.
I'm totally down telling people they're doing shit. Like, I'm sorry, if you're doing a Mythic plus 15, there's a certain expectation from you. If you're doing like shit and I'm telling you doing shit, that's not toxic, that's me telling you to get fucking better, okay? Because, first of all, I'm doing you a massive favor telling you you suck, because, like, you're not gonna get invited to any other group at this point, right? It's like people will just stop inviting you, right? You're gonna have a hard time finding a group. You knowing that you suck, I think, is a good move. Now, it might not feel great to tell somebody, like, to the person straight up, it's like, hey, man, you fucking suck, you know? That might not feel good, but in my opinion, that's a motivator to do better. So, whatever, you know, to which his own.
To allowing third-party add-ons and mods in 14 is that we don't want to foster an environment where DPS meters and add-ons for raiding and dungeons is the norm. Because once you have the expectation built in within the community, if you are new, you don't know your rotation, you underperform, or for some reason you don't know the add-ons, you don't know north, south, east, west, where to stand in the safe spot, you naturally get flamed upon because the expectation is really seeded within the community, which is basically what you see on screen here. So just to reiterate again, this video is not about 14 dungeons or WoW dungeons are better. They are not the same. It's apples and oranges. You can't compare them. They are built differently. There's a trade-off to asking for more difficult dungeon content in 14, especially if it's tied to the story, especially if it's tied to content that the majority of the player base is currently enjoying. And number two, there is a trade-off to asking for like DPS meters, all these external third-party, you know, add-ons that allows you to monitor players' performances in PvE or maybe even PvP settings in 14. There's a trade-off. You might not see it in 1 week or 2 weeks, but you will see it in the long run due to how the community builds in certain expectations of new players. And I really don't know if you want to foster an environment like what these people are basically highlighting on screen. I just thought it's a very interesting topic because with the launch of WoW Dragonflight, I know a lot of 14 players are checking it out. And it's also a good reminder of what we currently have in 14 and what the potential reality is like. And maybe the grass is not always greener on the other side. So that's basically my quick 2 cents on the issue. If you enjoyed my take, do subscribe to the channel, join our happy family, that would mean the world to me. I stream on Twitch, feel free to swing by to hang out. Last but not least, a big shout out to my Patreon subscribers for keeping the channels alive. Have a great day, folks. I will see you soon.
Hey, level up. Yeah, well, as always, a pretty good take by Quazii. I don't necessarily, like, I agree with the issues and I agree with, like, his take, but for the most part, I would say the game, like, WoW encourages toxicity way more than Final Fantasy, and Final Fantasy also punishes toxicity more. Even though the World of Warcraft, technically you have ways to punish toxicity by, like, literally vote kicking someone on the last boss, like that would show that guy, right? Which happened to me, you know, it is what it is. But I mean, like, I think the just WoW just breeds toxicity a lot more than Final Fantasy, just based on its design, and that's that. Yeah. Anyways, thanks for watching. Do the YouTube stuff, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.